welcome to our podcast, which does not have a name.
Well, we're working on it.
It will. This is our season 1, episode 1 about the Christiana Riot. I think as long as we have a name by like episode 3, we'll be good. I think that like once we have 3 in the bank, I'm probably going to start posting them.
We'll just edit that in.
Yeah. So I think, 3 episodes in, we should know, because that's when I want to start putting them up. But I want to get some in the bank first. So for this first season, I wanted to talk about the Christiana Riot, which happened in Christiana, Pennsylvania in 1851, and was a pivotal event leading up to the Civil War. Sources for the whole series is the book Bloody Dawn by Thomas P. Slaughter, which is a really good nonfiction book. Like it's like
read that.
I don't think that it's in print anymore. I had to get a used copy. But it's like just very highly readable. It's got like a narrative flow. Like it's a very easy reading nonfiction.
Is that his real
book.
Name?
Yes, I think so. Yeah,
He didn't do that on purpose?
No. He's written a few other like Pennsylvania history books.
Do they all have blood in the title?
No. I didn't even make that connection. But no, like I've read a fair amount of like nonfiction books, and I found his to just be like just an enjoyable read. Like I could just sit down and read it for fun. For this particular episode, some other sources are eyewitnesstohistory.com about Frederick Douglass, and AmericanHeritage.com, the daring escape of Frederick Douglass. So part of the reason I wanted to talk about the Christiana Riot is because, number one, because it's a topic that isn't already covered by a ton of other podcasts. I think that's like the main thing that made me think about it. But it also is a pretty historically significant event that doesn't get a lot of coverage. It actually led to the largest treason trial in U.S. history. 41 people were indicted for treason because of the events of this riot. I think the next closest was like a weird Michigan militia in the early 2000s. It was like 7 guys. So 41 people indicted for treason is a massive treason trial, largest in U.S. history. Telling the story also kind of provides us with a snapshot of life on the Mason-Dixon line in the years leading up to the Civil War. The border between Pennsylvania and Maryland was a hotbed of abolitionism, escaped slaves, slave catchers, mutual resistance organizations. Like there was like a little mini war prior to the Civil War going on along this border.
Well, there was a lot of stuff swirling around because it was like, it was obviously just geographically, it was like the intersection of like, slaves that wanted to get away from being slaves.
Yeah.
People that wanted to catch those slaves. And the abolitionists who were like, could actually help.
Yes.
Yeah, you can be an abolitionist in like the middle of Canada, but you're not doing anybody any good.
No. And I mean, Canada does come up later in the story, but there's some helpful abolitionists.
Yeah, but I feel like once you get to Canada,
they're providing housing and jobs and things like that.
Which is all good stuff.
Yeah. But, some other things about this is this riot and the trial that follows definitely pushed a number of Southerners into thinking that union was no longer possible. There's a lot of accounts of people after this trial just basically saying like, that's it. Like, there's no way we're staying together. It's, this is the early secession movement kind of got a kick from these events. This also proved that the Compromise of 1850, which obviously passed the year before, was just dead on arrival. It almost immediately shows that the Compromise of 1850 was never going to work. It helped James Buchanan get elected president, and it inspired both partially inspired both the Gettysburg campaign and the Lincoln assassination.
All right.
So it has a lot of ramifications for the upcoming Civil War. And this is an event, 14, 15 years prior to the Civil War. And I think that's also kind of an important thing to look at, where it's a slow burn. It's a slow buildup. Like, you don't go 0 to 60 on a Civil War.
Right.
These are events 15 years prior that are helping set the stage for it and helping see the divisions that are growing. And I think a lot of times when we're studying Civil War history, it's just kind of like people do like beats of American history. They're like, oh, there was the American Revolution, and then there was the Articles of Confederation followed by the Constitution, and then there was the Mexican American War, and then there was the Civil War.
Right.
They don't talk about like the slow buildup, and so this kind of shows some of that slow buildup to Civil War.
Yeah, and like the politics leading up to the Civil War, obviously it's important for just historical context of how that conflict came to be, but also just like, I don't know, a civil war happened. That's a significant event in a nation's history, and I'm often like a little bit surprised at how incurious people seem to be about how that happened. And like there are a lot of people who are like Civil War history enthusiasts, but it like a lot of them seem like they're really focused on the actual like battles that make up the war. And like, not that those weren't important and didn't have like important consequences, but to me it's way less interesting, like, because people get really into like, oh, that's what the epaulets looked like on the the Virginia Volunteers, like, and like, that's cool. Like, it's cool to nerd out about whatever you want to nerd out about, but like to me it's way more interesting like how like ideas came to be like influential on like mass groups of people, and like like you said, a civil war doesn't just fall out of the sky. Like, it happened for reasons, and we should probably know why.
You can, the slow build could be happening
now.
But really quickly before we really get into it, I just wanted to touch on some language issues that are going to come up throughout this.
Are you going to say the N-word a lot of times?
No, that's the first thing. Is like, there are some quotes. I don't think in this episode, I might have even just left them out entirely, but there are definitely quotes from the time that use the N-word, and I'm going to say N-word. Like, I understand the argument for like, warts and all, viewing history accurately. I don't want to say that word, so I'm not going to. I'm just not going to, because I don't like it, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. So I'm not going to.
Everybody knows what you mean.
Yes. But also, I really don't like slave owner. Slave owner always rubs me the wrong way. It feels like legitimizing to me. Like, I feel like you can't really morally own another person.
Like, what would you call him? Like a captor?
Well, so I came across somebody who used the word slaver to refer to anybody who keeps or captures people for slavery. And so throughout the series, I'm going to mostly use the word slaver instead of slave owner, because slave owner just always has bothered me.
It's like homeowner. It's too it's too value neutral.
Yes. And then the one final thing is just calling it the Christiana Riot. So that name in itself kind of has a little bit of a history, where right after the events of the riot and the trial, there were kind of two ways of thinking, where if you were more on the side of the slaves or the ex-slaves, you would call it a riot. And if you were on the side of the Southerners, you would call it the Christiana tragedy.
Okay.
So you kind of going back
like a war of northern aggression kind of thing.
Yeah. So like looking up like older, sources closer to the time, you would find things that were titled Christiana tragedy or Christiana riot. And then kind of going forward from there, people started calling it the Christiana incident, which is kind of like the centrist position.
Right.
If there was an incident in Christiana, it was the fence sitter way of talking about the event. And then even in more modern times, like the last, 40 or 50 years, people started calling it the Christiana resistance. Kind of like saying like, yeah, these are these cool, like, escaped people resisting their captor. And that was kind of me. Like, for a long time, I referred to it as the Christiana resistance.
Mm-hmm.
I fell into that group of people who thought that calling it a resistance was like a way to honor the people who were fighting back. But then more recently, I've kind of come around to riots. And like the idea that rioting isn't an inherently bad thing and it can be justified.
Yeah, sometimes you got to pitch a riot.
And so like I flipped back to calling it the Christiana riot, because sometimes riots are righteous.
Yeah.
And that, just one more thing before I get into it. I am pro people killing their slavers. That is a position that I am going to take throughout this. I understand the pacifist position of like you shouldn't kill anyone and you should avoid violence at all costs. I respect pacifism, but I'm going to come at this from
if someone enslaved you, you'd probably try to kill them.
Yeah, I'm going to come at this from an angle of like the people killing the slaver were in the right.
Yeah.
And you know that might not be a popular position in America much longer. I think that there is some educational policies on the horizon that don't want to portray slavery as all that bad.
Yeah, and I want to clarify my position on slavery.
Yeah.
I'm against it.
Yes.
I'm against people who owned slaves in the 1850s.
Yes.
Like, I understand. Like, I'm not totally on board with judging every historical figure from, like, you know, the morality and like cultural mores of like the society that I was raised in. I understand times were different.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you read accounts of like, you know, like slaves that had been like manumitted in like ancient Rome and stuff like that. And like, those were like societies where even people who were enslaved seemed like they thought that the institution of slavery was just fine.
Yeah.
Like, you know, they didn't like being slaves, obviously. Mm-hmm. But, you know, they were like, oh, I'm glad I'm not a slave anymore. But now I should get some slaves because it's a good thing for people to have slaves. And that's how societies work. But there's like a whole continuum. Like, I feel like if you were an ancient Roman who has never even been exposed to the idea that slavery should be considered wrong.
Right.
You're on one end. On the other end is like someone who now thinks that we should bring back the institution of chattel slavery. Right. You're a monster. Mm-hmm. And like in the middle are people who kept slaves in the 1850s. Like they were raised in a society where that was the norm, but it's not like they weren't exposed to differing opinions on that matter.
No.
Like no one in 1850 hadn't heard the idea that like, you know, maybe it's wrong to own other human beings. Like,
well, yeah, there had been a strong abolition movement before the United States was even a country.
Yeah.
Like the abolition movement in the land that would become the United States started during colonial times.
It didn't, I think it was it Germantown, Pennsylvania? They were like the first municipality to outlaw slavery.
Oh, they might be. I don't know.
It was like the 1680s. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. And, Benjamin Franklin's always a good example because he was a slaveholder. And then Benjamin Lay convinced him that it was wrong, and he changed his mind and freed the people that he had enslaved. So it was possible. It was possible to like be exposed to the ideas of abolition and realize you were wrong and change your mind and do the right thing.
And I don't think that it's a hard argument to make.
No.
It's like I can't believe that most of the people who owned slaves and were then exposed to the idea that was wrong. Just the idea of it was unjust and unfair. And, you know, this is putting aside the issue of like, you know, slavery as like a punishment for some like crime. That I view as kind of a separate issue. I'm still against it.
Yeah.
But like chattel slavery, like you're a slave because you were born to be a slave. Like it's not hard to point out how that's wrong.
Right.
And I have to believe that like people who, you know, heard the arguments against it and decided that they were in the right to like keep owning people, like it was a material incentive that like swayed their argument. They didn't like weigh the arguments in fairness.
No.
And decide that like, no, slavery is like the just and righteous thing to do. I mean, you know, there's some people that there was like weird religious elements, and I'm not trying to paint like Christianity broadly as like a pro-slavery institution. Like a lot of abolitionists were inspired by their Christian faith. Like John Brown.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, John Brown was a super, super devout Christian, and he killed a lot of slavers.
Yes, he did.
Like because he thought God wanted him to.
Mm-hmm.
But there definitely was, like, there were a lot of arguments. You can use, religion's like a force multiplier for whatever
Yeah.
argument you want to make. Like, if you want to convince bad people to do good things, you might be able to use religion to do it. And if you want to convince good people to do bad things, you might be able to use religion to do it. And there was a lot of that, like, like black people were supposed to be like hewers of wood and like carriers of water because like they were descended from like Noah's bad son that looked at him naked. And I don't know, it doesn't really hold up. But
no,
I'm just saying, if you were a slave owner in 1851, like, you knew it was wrong.
Yes.
There was a part of you that knew what you were doing was wrong.
Yeah. And so we'll jump into this because the slaver in this particular story knew it was wrong. And that becomes apparent as we go through his brief biography here a little bit. So get into it now. For episode 1, we are going to cover the escape. So in November, this takes place in November of 1849. Edward Gorsuch was the owner of the Retreat Farm in Baltimore County, Maryland. They produced wheat, bacon, potatoes, cider, jelly, pickles, molasses, sweet potatoes. They had around 50 cows, calves, pigs, sheep, ducks, chickens. It was a huge farm. They had everything.
It's a regular old farm for the region.
Yeah. Got a little bit of everything going on there. Mostly wheat. Wheat was their cash crop. The original tract, the Gorsuch family were one of the earliest European settlers in the region. Originally, they had 10,000 acres, and then it was subdivided. And so by the 1840s, 1850s, the family had 2 adjacent farms in northern Baltimore County, one named Retirement and one named Retreat. And like I said, Edward Gorsuch was the owner of Retreat.
Is there any relation to Neil Gorsuch?
I don't know. I actually did kind of wonder that because that is that whole like DC world.
Yeah, I don't know where he was born, but I know he like went to school around there.
Yeah, it's not that uncommon of like a last name though either. Yeah. So could be. I didn't really look. I pondered it, but I didn't really look into it. So Retreat Farm was said to be named after its role in the War of 1812. I looked at some like 1812 like retreat maps of that area. And I think that was probably just family legend. I didn't see any like direct evidence of like a retreat going through the farmland. Yeah, people
make stuff up.
I mean, there was definitely some action close to there. It's possible like a detachment or something moved through there. And it seemed like it was a kind of a big deal to the Gorsuch family. They like one of their, Edward's grandfather was like a, lieutenant in the army during the War of 1812. Like it seemed like it was important to them, but I don't know that there was any actual War of 1812 connection there. The house where Edward and his wife lived had started as a 1.5-story log cabin and was expanded over the years with stone additions so that by 1849 it was a 3-story, mostly stone structure. So it's a giant house they're living in. They're doing quite well. It notably had metal bars on the basement windows, which
is creepy.
So subsequently, the Gorsuch family has talked about how those metal bars were to protect the house from wolves and panthers.
What?
Well, I did look into it, and it is possible that there was wolves and panthers around when this house was built.
Yeah, I mean, especially wolves, but like, I don't know. Do the wolves jump into your basement if you don't have metal bars in the woods?
I mean, I guess at that time that's where you would store a lot of your food.
I just feel like there's wolves in a lot of parts of the country, and people don't have metal bars.
I think they were lying. I think it had to do with keeping people. Because like by the time
I feel like metal bars over windows are usually to keep people either in or out.
Yeah, I think it was for keeping people in.
Yeah.
Because the Gorsuch family owned a tavern on this road, the York Road that went through the region. I think the tavern sat technically on the property of Retirement Farm, but it's all basically the same property. And the tavern had holding cells for people traveling.
For like drunks?
No, for people traveling with their slaves. Like if you were heading to like a slave auction in Baltimore, you could stop at the Gorsuch Tavern and you could lock up your chattel in the basement and like have a dinner and go to sleep upstairs.
Because I know we covered this already, but that's one of the ways slavery's wrong. Like, because people act like these slaves were like, I don't know, valued farm equipment, I guess. Mm-hmm. But like, You don't like you casually lock up farm animals so they don't wander off.
Yeah.
You don't have to bar every avenue of escape because their spirit is yearning for freedom.
Yeah.
Like,
No.
like you, that tells you that it's not okay.
No. And so I would imagine, like, my hunch is that, like, the basement of the farmhouse might have served as some kind of overflow.
Yeah.
If the
Tavern filled
the
up.
tavern holding cells filled up. Because by when this house was built, there were still some wolves and cougars in Baltimore County, but very, very few. It was not like an actual. They had throughout colonial times they had put a bounty on those animals, and so by like the early, United States years, that those species had pretty much been wiped out in that part of the country. So I think the metal bars at in the basement of this house had humans in mind. Also on this property, they had a bunch of outbuildings, sheepfold, ox stable, blacksmith shop, spring house, corn house, hog house, obviously slave quarters. And one thing that kind of stuck out to me a little bit was their barn. They had a fieldstone barn that was built in 1841, and it was very clearly done in the same style as fieldstone barns in southeastern Pennsylvania. Like you could see how, I don't think it would be an architect who would do that at the time, but the builders of the time were moving back and forth across the border. And it kind of just shows how these regions were very much the same. Southeastern PA, Northern Maryland is not really very different.
Yeah, no.
But they were divided with this humongous issue of slavery. And like,
if you like woke up in Oxford,
yeah,
Pennsylvania, you wouldn't know you weren't in Maryland without being told.
No, and so anybody who doesn't know us who's listening to this, we're both from that kind of tri-state region of Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, where all three of those states touch. And yeah, there's no Oxford, Pennsylvania, and Rising Sun, Maryland are not noticeably different. They're very similar places. And so looking at a picture of this barn, it was like, oh, this could be a barn, just down the street from here.
Yeah.
These are clearly like culturally pretty much the same people. But on one side of the imaginary line.
Well, and when you're talking about like the produce of the farm, that's like, I was like, okay, yeah, normal Pennsylvania farm.
Yeah.
Southeast Pennsylvania farm.
But, they've got this line, and on one side of the line, you can own humans. On the other side of the line, you can't.
Which is like a big law. That's not like, that's not like, no right turns on red or whatever. Like, it's pretty profound.
Mm-hmm. It's important. And it's so when I talk about how this story kind of illustrates the life along the Mason-Dixon line in the years leading up to the Civil War, that's kind of the thing I'm talking about, is where you have this huge issue that is dividing people who are otherwise
neighbors,
the same.
Yeah.
So by 1849, the Gorsuch family had lived in Baltimore for 200 years. Edward at this point was, 1849, the Gorsuch family had lived in Baltimore for 200 years. Edward had inherited the farm from his uncle 4 years prior, in 1845. And at the time, Edward was 50 years old and had 5 grown children. So that is going to be kind of key in who Edward is as a person and what motivates his actions throughout this story, was that he had lived his life before he became the master of this farm. He was 50 years old. His kids are grown and moved out and living their own lives. He spent most of his life working for his uncle. Mm-hmm. And that in some ways seemed to have wounded his pride. And the fact that he was finally now at 50 years old, the large landowner, respected patriarch of the family.
They get a little bit of chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, it was really important to him. It was really important to him that he was finally like his own man and finally in charge. I scrolled too far down. And that pride would really end up being like a theme throughout this upcoming story. So for a quick rundown, slavery, just what it was like for slaves in Northern Maryland at the time, or agriculture in Northern Maryland at the time. Northern Maryland produced 1.5 times more agriculture than the rest of Maryland. It was the most productive region of the state. So it had the highest property values. So as soon as Gorsuch inherited this land from his uncle, immediately became a very wealthy man.
It's weird. I know it because, I've read books, but
Mm-hmm.
it still always like strikes me as a little bit jarring when I'm looking back at, any pre-industrial time period, and like it's productive farmland is what made an area rich.
Yeah.
Because that's not how it works anymore.
No.
Like where people farm is where people are poor now.
Right.
Like,
Right. So Gorsuch owned 12 people. 4 of them were adult men who did all the manual labor. They were Noah Burley, John and George Hammond, and Nelson Ford. Gorsuch was among the largest slaveholders in all of Maryland at the time. Only 10% of slaveholders in Maryland owned more than 8 people. So at 12, he was definitely in the like upper 1% of slaveholders for
and
the
like
state.
the big plantations were mostly like in like the deep
They
south,
were in the deep
right?
south,
Yeah.
yeah. So by 1849, only 5% of the population of northern Maryland was enslaved. They had a large free black population. About 7 in 10 black people in Maryland were free. That was the largest free black population of any state in the country. So they had most, if you ran into a black guy in Maryland in 1850,
Odds are he was free.
Odds are they were a free one, a free person. Predictably, the free blacks were demonized by the white residents of Maryland. They were blamed for thefts. Laws were passed preventing them from owning guns and owning dogs, which I always forget about. That like dogs were, I don't know, at the time dogs were almost a more reliable weapon than a gun.
Yeah, dogs were a big deal, especially when you read like accounts of like escaped slaves and stuff, as I'm sure you've done like
Yes.
for this. Even.
Yes.
Like the dogs come up a lot.
They
Like
do.
the dogs are what like they were scared was going to get them.
Mm-hmm. So free black people in Maryland needed certain proofs of ownership before they could sell things.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to sell something, you needed to have a special document that proved that you owned it before you could sell it. Slaves could only testify in court against free black people.
Oh,
That was like
that's a weird rule.
Yeah, they were like, okay, you can't testify. Like, well, they didn't view them as people, so they're like, you can't testify in court unless it's against like a free black man because we are trying to get them.
Yeah, we'll take whatever we can get to convict a black man of a crime.
Right. Laws preventing black people from testifying against whites, just in general, were constantly like passed and repealed throughout like early Maryland history. Like there'd be like they'd pass a law that said like black people cannot testify against white people under any circumstances. And then 10 years later, that law would get repealed. And then 5 years later, a new version would get passed. And it just kind of went back and forth like that. So at any given time in early Maryland history, black people may or may not be allowed to testify against white people, period.
So I feel like I'm getting the impression that while the majority of black people were free in Maryland at this time, they were like grudgingly free. Like that it wasn't like the powers that be in the state making the laws and whatnot were not cool with having the largest free black population.
No. So
it seemed like they might have been a little nervous about that.
Yes. So in all, free black people made up 13% of the population of Baltimore County at the time, and 1/3 of the prison population. So a disproportionate number of prisoners. Laws were passed to sell these free black people back into temporary servitude as a punishment for crimes, or they could just straight up banish them from the state. And it also was a felony for a free black person to possess any abolitionist material. So they were, and that we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But they were
about what abolition, like
just the
pamphlets and
yes,
and like inflammatory like literature.
So there was a lot of fears of the influence that the free black population would have on the enslaved
they thought they
black
would
population.
Inspire servile insurrection.
Yes.
Yeah,
and so that we'll touch on that again in a little bit. Gorsuch himself, he viewed himself as a good owner. he didn't expect that his slaves would be wanting to escape, and he made provisions to free them at the age of 28, and then keep them on as paid labor. So he thought like that made him a good dude. He's like, yeah, I'm a good one. I'm not going to be mean to them. I'll free them when they turn 28, and that'll keep them happy, and they won't want to escape. Um, he still could have freed his slaves outright, or he could have paid them for all their years of like back labor when he freed them. He didn't do any of that kind of stuff, but he still saw himself as a good guy. Um, Noah Burley, John Hammond were both in their early 20s at the time. Nelson Ford and George Hammond were 19 and 20, so they're all kind of between the ages of 19 and 24. The men that were
young adult men,
and in Gorsuch's mind, they were not far away from their being free. Like, oh, another 8 or 9 years for the younger guys, another 4 or 5 years for the older guys. Like they'll be freed soon enough. They should be happy where they're at. After the riot, the Gorsuch family would describe Burley as a copper-colored mulatto with a treacherous disposition.
Oh.
So they kind of turned they changed their opinion of them after the events that are going to unfold. Ford was given lighter work as a teamster due to his delicate physical condition.
He was a frail guy.
He was the frail one, so he drove the teams of oxen or horses or whatever. That was kind of how life on the farm was for these guys. Gorsuch thought that they respected him, and that they were content with having their freedom on the horizon. And just over and over again throughout this, Gorsuch is going to show just how out of touch slavers were with the realities of how people don't like being enslaved.
Yeah,
like he really through a lot of this thinks like, why would they be upset? Why wouldn't they like me?
Yeah, it's weird. Like when you read like like letters that Confederates wrote like during the Civil War and stuff. There's like so many where like like the Union Army came through an area, and like all the slaves ran off because like they could. They were like, oh, it was like an opportunity to escape slavery, and the people that like had owned them are like totally unwilling to even like countenance the idea that they ran away.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, they're like, the Union stole our slaves. Like they must have taken them off against their will. They never would have left voluntarily. They were so happy here.
Mm-mm. Yeah. And that Gorsuch is definitely that kind of guy. By all accounts, he didn't beat his slaves, which is, I don't know, an important distinction. Who knows?
Yeah.
Like that's not like they would have recorded that, but that's what the family claims, is that he never beat them. He viewed himself as a New Testament father and claimed that he saw his slaves as among his children, which is bullshit. He can say that all he wants. They're clearly not your children because you don't let them leave. His children were grown and had moved out.
I don't know. Some of Thomas Jefferson's slaves were his children.
It's true. That is true.
A lot of people had slaves that were their children.
Yeah.
But not this guy.
I just feel like you can't.
He meant it spiritually.
He meant it spiritually, and I think that's horseshit.
Yeah.
Gorsuch had Quaker ancestry. He had Quaker neighbors. He was a class leader in a liberal Methodist Episcopal church, and claimed that all of this influenced his moral thinking on slavery and his plan to free his slaves at 28. So that's like what we were touching on at the beginning, where he knew it was wrong.
Right.
He had all of these influences.
He knew it was wrong. Well, and he acknowledged that it was wrong to the extent that he planned to free them at a future date.
Yes.
It's like, I don't understand that guy.
Yeah.
Like, how can you do that? Like, I don't know. I guess like you're like, okay, it's wrong, but it's not that bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy.
Like, was he trying to help? Like, was he like, keep working for me until you're 28? And then when you're 28, like, I've like saved up this amount of money from like the work that you did.
No, he didn't pay him for back labor.
Yeah, see, I don't get it then.
It made more financial sense for him to keep him.
Yeah.
No, it didn't either. It didn't either, though. We'll come up to that because it didn't make financial sense for him, really. I think it was just his pride thing. He just liked being the big master of the house. and like master of the plantation. I think it just came down to his image of himself. He liked being the big man in charge. Um, it is interesting that he talked about his slaves as family, because that does seem like it reflected a more northern view of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
where in that kind of northern tidewater region, the idea of your slaves being like a family in the same way that people might view like their dog as part of their family.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a kind of
Like with affection,
Yeah.
but not equality.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was kind of a common view in like that part of the South. Whereas when you go further south to the big plantations in in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, there was this ever-present fear of slave revolts.
Well, they had lots of slaves,
Yes.
and like they that's where like you got like the big plantations where there's like like 30 white guys and like 200 slaves. Like,
Yeah.
it's
And it's just interesting how like even within the future Confederacy, slavery wasn't like a monolith. It wasn't just one thing.
yeah.
It was in the North. It was these like this weird little creepy family version of slavery, and in the South, it was this big factory version of slavery.
Well, and they had very different ideas about secession too. Like when they were debating secession, like amongst themselves, like leading up to like the actual Civil War, like Virginia, there's like you said, the sort of like Tidewater South, like they were the region where I don't know, it was sort of like all tied up with like the image of themselves as like sort of like Jeffersonian, like agrarian, like everyone is like a lord unto himself. Like it was much more like philosophically motivated. Whereas like in the Deep South, it was very much just a bold economic, like, no, slavery is the cornerstone of our economy, so we're going to keep having slaves.
Yeah.
The South definitely wasn't monolithic when it came to their attitudes about slavery or secession or the concept of America.
No. And I think another just distinction there is that in the more northern part of the future Confederacy, slaves were not locked up. They had those bars in the basement windows or the cages in the tavern, but that was for people who were traveling to a slave market for
Right. Those slaves are going to run away because they don't know what's going to happen to them. It might be terrible. Like a lot of those people might be people who have just been ripped away from their families.
Yeah, and a lot of them are going to be sold to the Deep South.
Yeah.
They're going to die.
Yeah, like a lot of them are going to be sold to
they're not necessarily going to die if they're sold to the Deep South. They might be sold to a Caribbean island where they're going to die.
Yeah, and they might be, and also, like I was saying, like it wasn't as normal in the northern South. Is there a better word? Could we call it the Tidewater South?
Tidewater, I think.
Yeah, it wasn't like as much of a norm in the Tidewater South. Like it was considered a little bit of a social faux pas to break up families.
Yes,
when you sold slaves, much more so than in the Deep South. Again, in the Deep South, it was like slaves were very much more viewed as just a commodity.
Yeah.
But it was fairly common as a punishment for like repeated infractions. Like that wasn't an uncommon thing in the Tidewater South, where like if you kept running away or like whatever, like if you did something real bad, they would sell you south.
Right.
And so like a lot of the people that are being locked up in the basement or whatever, they're people that like have just been taken away from their family and they know they're never going to see their family again. Like those aren't like those are people that have a lot of impetus to try and get away.
And so within the farms, though, people generally weren't locked up, and they would have free access to the master's house, and be able to just kind of, they want them to have access to the house. They want them to be available to come bring them a fucking glass of milk in the middle of the night if they need it. Where in the Deep South, they were locked away separate, because they were afraid that if they came into their house at night, they would slit their throats.
Yeah. Well, in the Deep South too, there was a lot of distinction between like, that's where like the real distinction between like the house slaves and the field slaves was, where like the field slaves really were treated like animals. Like a lot of times they were chained up every night.
Yeah.
Like, whereas like there were a handful of like house slaves that, if you wanted to have domestic servants, you had to grant them like a little bit more access, and just because that was the job.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So this kind of it's weird to call it a more mild version of slavery, but this kind of, I don't know, less abusive version of slavery that was common in the Tidewater and that Gorsuch practiced was likely something that would actually increase the chances of escape. Frederick Douglass wrote about how treating slaves well increased the likelihood of escape. He said, "Beat and cuff your slave, keep him hungry and spiritless, and he will follow the chain of his master like a dog. But feed and clothe him well, work him moderately, surround him with physical comfort and dreams of freedom and truth. Give him a bad master, and he aspires to a good master. Give him a good master, and he wishes to become his own master." And Frederick Douglass knew what he was talking about.
Well, yeah, and it stands to reason. Like, you can break a person's spirit.
Yes.
You shouldn't.
No.
But you can.
You can't if they're Frederick Douglass, and we'll touch on that a little bit too.
But yeah, like and that's the thing. Like, it's not. That's the thing when people like this asshole, like when they try and like justify their enslavement of other people by be like, well, I wasn't like a bad slave owner. Like, I was like, I was like one of the good slave owners. I was nice. Like, it's not. I mean, people don't want to be chained up every night and like whipped for minor infractions, obviously.
Yeah.
But like, people have like an inherent desire for like agency and self-determination. Like, people don't want to be owned.
No.
Like, it doesn't matter how nice you are to them. They probably don't want to be owned.
No. So Northern Maryland at the time, like I said, were mostly producing wheat. Having switched from tobacco to wheat meant that slaves didn't really make financial sense anymore. And that's what I had said when I had mentioned that Gorsuch wasn't just doing this because he wanted their labor.
Like, they're just kind of a status symbol almost.
It's yeah. Like, tobacco had kept people busy all year. Wheat was intense labor at harvest and then not a whole hell of a lot to do for the rest of the year.
So it's like the kind of thing where it makes sense to hire on day laborers during like harvest season.
Yeah. And
like apple picking.
Right. And then not have to feed them for the rest of the year.
Right. Like, that's what apple orchards do. They hire on a bunch of temporary labor during harvest season. Yeah. And then there's like one guy that works there the rest of the year.
Right. So while Gorsuch would not sell his slaves, about 12% of Maryland slaves were auctioned off per year and mostly shipped to the deep south, to these much worse plantations that we were talking about. Gorsuch tried to take a middle course. He tried to keep the slaves, but then free them when they were 28 and refused to sell them south. He thought that he was kind of being a centrist slaveholder. Yeah. And so that's kind of where they were in 1849, and around harvest time, this is, like I said, this is November of 1849, the granary was full of wheat, and Gorsuch noticed that it was about 3 bushels low, which is too low for rodents, and there was no sign of larger animals. So he kind of made a mental note that it was likely human. It was likely human, yeah. Most slavers at the time expected some degree of petty theft. A lot of slaves saw it as their right.
It's like restaurant workers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You're going to pay people poorly and treat them badly. Mm-hmm. They're going to steal a little bit.
Right. So it was kind of a built-in thing, kind of accepted that there'd be some degree of theft. And a lot of people, like even Gorsuch himself, kind of saw it as if the slaves were wanting for anything, that they had failed as a master.
Right.
And it was if they had to steal something and sell it, that meant that you weren't providing them with their needs. So that was kind of a common view amongst
the noble slave holders.
And it's also kind of a common view amongst slaves. They're like, well, I need shit and he's not providing it, so I'm gonna
he's not following through on his end of the bargain.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get what I want. Frederick Douglass, recalling his time as a slave in Maryland, wrote, "Considering that my labor and person were the property of my master, and that I was by him deprived of the necessities of life, necessities obtained by my own labor, it was easy to deduce the right to supply myself with what was my own. It was simply appropriating what was my own to use for for my master, since health and strength derived from such food were exerted in his service.
Jesus, man. I'm just Frederick Douglass is an impressive dude.
Yeah.
He's such a like an eloquent writer.
Mm-hmm.
And then you consider that like he like taught himself to read secretly, like
Yeah.
from like marks that people made on like parts of ships.
Well, so I want to actually give a quick rundown of Frederick Douglass right here, because Frederick Douglass was a slave in Northern Maryland right around this time. You know, he was a few years older than the men who would escape from Gorsuch's farm, but he is instrumental later in this story. He is a large part of this. And he's from this region, so his experience as a slave in Northern Maryland kind of provides a glimpse of what life was like for slaves in general in Northern Maryland. And like you said, he's such an eloquent writer and such a great communicator.
Yeah, it's a great historical resource.
Yeah, so that he kind of provides like a good insight for what life was just like. So just I wanted to touch on that. So Frederick Douglass was born in 1818. He lived at home with his mother, or lived on the plantation with his mother, I think until he was about 7. And then he had some contact with her over the next few years until he was about 12, until she was sent to work for another planter about 12 miles away. And he was considered lucky at the time that he had been able to be, raised by his mother for 7 years and get to know his mother for 12 years. That was considered fortunate for slaves at the time. And then she was sent away. He never knew his father. He had heard that it was a white man, and there was talk that the man was his enslaver. But of this, he said, "I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me." So, maybe his slaver was his father. He doesn't know. And doesn't seem like he was particularly interested in finding out. He, interestingly, didn't really work a lot as a child. His particular plantation didn't try to keep the kids busy.
Mm-hmm.
He was kind of allowed to have some degree of freedom as a young kid, but he also wasn't really like cared for. So while he wasn't worked hard, he often commented on being cold and hungry. The plantation that he lived on was run by a man named Colonel Edward Lloyd, who kept his slaves so hungry that he would cover the fences around the orchard with tar, so that when somebody tried to sneak over the fence and steal some fruit, they would get like tar on their pants and they'd be able to be identified and punished. So, that was his solution to him. Oh, my slaves are so hungry that they keep trying to steal apples.
I need to protect my apples.
Yeah. Frederick was also, like I said, commented on being extremely cold through this period of his childhood. He wrote that his feet were so cracked with frost that a pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes.
Huh. My feet have been that cracked before.
Yeah, it's not good.
No.
So around the age of 7, Douglass was sent to Baltimore to work with the Auld family. The Aulds were his slaver's son-in-law's brother. The Aulds had not previously owned slaves, and so they didn't treat Frederick horribly. They were like, I guess we'll treat you kind of like a person.
They were like, I guess you live here now.
Yeah. So Sophia Auld, the mother of the family, started teaching him how to read, and then her husband Thomas, who is a bastard that will come up a little bit later, stopped her. He's like, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? You can't teach a slave to read.
You're not supposed
Stop
to do
that."
that.
Yeah. So she stopped it. But Frederick would later say that moment like made him more determined than ever to learn how to read. Like he got a taste of it, and then it was taken away from him. And he was like, okay, there's something here. I need to.
Reading is great.
Yeah. So like you said, he would learn to read by like picking up little scraps of whatever he could and kind of teaching himself. He also learned to read by just making friends with white kids. He would find like white kids around his own age, like when he was out running errands, and he would just befriend them and convince them to
give him a reading
lesson. Because, he's a charismatic dude. He was good at like convincing people to listen to him. So he was able to convince these white kids to kind of break the rules and teach them to read a little bit. As a teenager, he was sent back to the farm that he was born on. But he had spent too much time in the city, had too much like relative freedom, that rural slavery just didn't work from him. He wasn't he didn't know how to behave on the farm. That wasn't what he's used to. So his Thomas Auld, the guy who was in charge of him at this point, sent him to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey.
Oh, that seems like a horrible thing.
Yeah,
to exist.
Yes, it is. So Covey kept him under constant surveillance, like worked him constantly. Just
It's like one of those like places where you send your dog when they won't stop acting up.
Yeah, or like a horse.
Yeah.
So the way he would do it is he'd keep Frederick under constant surveillance. He'd work him from like sun up to sundown to like the point of exhaustion. He'd beat him daily, like regardless
to break his spirit.
Like to break his spirit. Yeah. And after 6 months of this, Douglas broke free and ran back to his legal slaver, Thomas Auld, and begged not to be returned to Covey, but was sent back again. He arrived back at Covey's place. Covey walked towards him with a rope, intent on tying him up to beat him as punishment for running back to the farm. And he wrote the turning point in my career as the slave. Instead of submitting, he took hold of his tormentor. He resisted for 2 hours. My long crushed spirit rose. Cowardice departed. Bold defiance took its place. And now resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day has passed forever when I would be a slave in fact. So he fought this dude for 2 hours and kicked his ass, which is awesome.
It's also a really long fight.
It is a really, really long fight. Just beat this dude for 2 hours. Covey could have called the authorities and had Douglas chained and publicly whipped without restraint, but he didn't. He didn't do anything about it. And Douglas would later speculate that Covey was afraid of losing his reputation as a slave breaker and would hurt his income. So he just kept quiet about the fact that one of the slaves that he was supposed to break beat the shit out of him.
All right.
So Douglas was then, Covey was done with him.
Lucky break for Frederick Douglass there. Yeah.
Yeah. So Covey kind of gave up on him. Douglas was sent to another less abusive master and then made his first attempt to escape. It was him and 4 other enslaved men made this whole plan. Douglas at this point knew how to read and write. He wrote them he made some forged passes. Mm-hmm. They were getting ready to sneak out and they got caught right away before it could even get off the ground. So they were punished, not too severely. And then Douglas, who was 18 at the time, was sent back to Baltimore, this time to work as a ship's caulker. Pretty shortly after that, while in Baltimore, I guess a few years after that, while in Baltimore, he borrowed some ID papers from a sailor. Interestingly, because he couldn't find anybody who looked enough like him, that he was he couldn't just get, like I said, most of the population, the black population of Baltimore at the time were free, and they had to carry papers to do anything to prove that they were free. And these papers would say, have a description of them, their relative height and weight, and whatever racist, I'm sure, depiction of what they looked like.
Or scars.
And Douglas couldn't find anybody that looked like him. So he was nervous about getting borrowing somebody else's papers. But then he found a sailor and he realized that people don't look as closely at sailors' papers. So he borrowed a paper from a sailor and he boarded a train to Philadelphia. And when the train conductor came by to check everybody's passes and make sure that all the black people on the train were allowed to be on there, he showed him the sailor's paper. And just like he predicted, the guy kind of just looked at it briefly and handed it back to him. People just weren't accustomed to closely examining sailors' papers at the time.
Did he not notice that he was black?
No, he was a black sailor.
Oh, okay. He was a black sailor. Okay.
He was a black sailor, but sailors' papers had this special eagle emblem on it. And I guess when people saw this eagle emblem, they're like, oh, you're a sailor. And they just didn't look at it closely. And it worked. That was, and so he made it to Philadelphia and on to freedom. And like I said, he's going to come up again later as we work through the events of this story. Back to Gorsuch's farm. I just wanted to give that quick interlude because I think that Douglas's life in Maryland kind of shows you a little bit about what life in Maryland for enslaved people was like at this point in history. So November 1849, the slaves back on Gorsuch's farm were cutting corn in the barn at night. This was light work. It was like one of the more enjoyable tasks of the year. They would tell jokes and sing songs.
Wait, I'm sorry, what were they doing?
Cutting corn.
Oh, okay.
So it was like a harvest thing where you'd gather up all the corn and you would like husk it and cut it and prepare it for whatever. And it was like it was the chore that people would kind of look forward to because it was more laid back. It wasn't strenuous. You were just kind of hanging out with everybody in the barn, like husking corn and like singing songs and cracking jokes. It was like the more enjoyable task that they had to do.
It wasn't like cutting tobacco where like people get like the green tobacco sickness and throw up all over the place.
And you can kind of see it like after, at the end of the harvest season, you get like a chance to like hang out with your coworkers and just do a light task and joke around.
Yeah.
It was the nice time for them. It was the thing they kind of enjoyed doing. But as a new slaver, Edward frequently interrupted and checked in on them, which is so humanizing. Like the idea of him being like this kind of insecure boss who felt the need to micromanage. Like it was the task that they all looked forward to, and he wouldn't let them just enjoy it. He had to like constantly bother them because he was insecure in his position. He hadn't been a master of the farm for very long, and he felt the need to constantly needle them. And honestly, I think it probably played some small role in their desire to escape when they escaped.
Yeah.
Is that, everybody's had a micromanager that you just want to get away from.
So like, Jesus, dude, we're doing it.
Yeah, just leave us the fuck alone. So while they were kind of hanging out, cutting the corn, there was a rumor that spread amongst the slaves that Gorsuch had figured out who took the grain, and that he was pissed about these 3 missing bushels of wheat. The rumor was probably based on some degree of truth. There was a local miller named Elias Matthews who grew suspicious when a free black man by the name of Abe Johnson tried to sell him 5 bushels of wheat. Because he knew Johnson, and he knew Johnson had no source of wheat. He's like, dude, what the hell? Why are you trying to sell me these? Where did you get all this wheat? What are you doing?
There's a lot of wheat to just have.
Yeah. So it's likely that Johnson trusted Matthews because the miller was a Quaker. And so he told him that the source was several of Gorsuch's slaves and that their usual source of moving grain had dried up, meaning that this wasn't their first theft. And that also was kind of cool because I never really thought about like the underground
like economy
that probably involved a lot of white people in the area too, where, if most masters expected a certain amount of theft and the theft would be, they weren't still stealing wheat to eat. They were stealing wheat to sell.
I was going to say, especially something like wheat, because you can't what are you going to do with wheat?
Yeah.
Like you have to process it for it to be useful.
Right. So, presumably these, the men on Gorsuch's farm had a previous source for moving the grain that no longer, for whatever reason, was no longer available. And so they were trying for the first time to see if they could move it through Elias Matthews. Johnson trusting Matthews may have shown that he had some history of helping black people, but, he viewed this as too much to ask, that, trying to sell his stolen wheat was too much. Elias Matthews would later talk about how helping Abe Johnson and the slaves could violate Gorsuch's trust and hurt his business, which would lessen his influence over slavers in the region and lessen his ability to support black people in the region. Which I can see how that is how you justify it to yourself. Because he's a Quaker, he's an abolitionist, but he's saying, well, if I don't play...
Wait, did he refuse to do it, or did he snitch on him?
He snitched on him.
Oh, see, I can see maybe that being a legitimate justification if you're like, no, I don't want to get involved in this. Like,
yeah,
take your stolen grain elsewhere. I'm sorry. I don't want the liability. But like, yeah, if you go snitching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, he didn't want to hurt his business. That's the real reason. But that was the excuse he told himself, was that he needed to maintain his influence over the slavers of the region so that he could advocate for abolition. And I kind of wonder how many other, abolitionists in name had a similar justification in this time period.
Yeah.
So Gorsuch would say the miller immediately called to see me and give me the information. I went to him to see the wheat, and I believed that it was mine, it perfectly corresponding with some that had just been in my granary, and which I had missed a quantity. I said nothing to my boys about it, but had a state. I'm losing my space here. I said nothing to my boys about it, but I had the state warrant issued for Abraham Johnson. But Johnson, finding out that they were after him, secreted himself away for a few days. So, a couple things there. Number one, the idea that Gorsuch could look at this wheat and be like, "Yep, that's my wheat," seems, I don't know, suspect to me.
Yeah.
Also, because it's not even the same quantity. He talks about like the corresponding quantity.
Right. It was 5.
It was 5, right? And he had 3 missing. So, I guess he's saying that he could look at this wheat and be like, out of that 5 bushels, this 3 belongs to me. I know it. I know my wheat on sight.
I mean, there's different kinds of wheat, but
maybe it was like bound in a different way. It's certainly possible.
I don't know. Like maybe it was like some of it was like red wheat. I don't know. I don't know that much about wheat, but I am skeptical that like it's not like it was branded.
No,
like it was wheat.
The other thing about it is just how his response to this was to have the state issue a warrant for the arrest of Abraham Johnson, the free black man. Like I had touched on earlier on, there was a lot of fear and distrust and hatred in this region for the free black people. Yeah. And so that's the person that Gorsuch immediately gets upset with.
The wheat fence.
Yeah, the free black man. So the whites of the region were trying to find Johnson. He'd hidden himself away. They were hoping that they could capture him and they could get him to incriminate whichever slave, that he could incriminate the slaves who had stolen the wheat, incorrectly believing that the slaves were completely unaware of any of this, which was not true. Like I said, back at the barn doing the corn cutting, they were spreading this rumor. And in fact, the slaves were actually hiding Johnson.
Oh.
So they were fully aware of everything that was going on. So one day, right around this time, preparing for that night's corn cutting, the men were shoveling corn into the wagon, getting ready to pull it into the barn. And one of the 4 men kind of casually asked a white carpenter if he knew if the boss would be coming by to the corn cutting that night. Is he gonna, think he's gonna be there tonight, or is he gonna leave us alone and let us do our thing? What do you think? Another one of the guys just made a point to announce rather loudly that he would be out setting rabbit traps early because it was going to be very dark that night. So they're all kind of being like, "Oh, where's the boss going to be?" Like, "Oh, if you don't see us, it's because we're out setting rabbit traps." So that night, November 6, 1849, the 4 men climbed out through the skylight at the rear of the barn and down a ladder and disappeared into the night. There's 2 stories about their escape. The first one is that another local slave by the name of Alexander Scott brought them to a train station in Baltimore, and they took the train from Baltimore up to Philadelphia. This was the story that was told by a black resident of Lancaster County years later, somebody who had known these men. The second story, which is the more likely one, because of, like we discussed about the papers and everything with Frederick Douglass's escape, it wasn't exactly easy for these men to just board a train and,
right.
So the second story was that they escaped.
They didn't know any sailors.
Right. So the second story is that they escaped up York Road, which is a road that goes from Baltimore to York, Pennsylvania. And that's what's considered more likely. Another just account of train stations in Baltimore at the time, from a guy named William Still, who had escaped on the Underground Railroad around this time period. He wrote, "Baltimore used to be in the days of slavery one of the most difficult places in the South for even free colored people to get away from, much more for slaves. The rule forbade any colored person leaving there by railroad or steamboat without such applicant had been weighed, measured, and given a bond signed by unquestionable signatures well known. So to get on a train or a boat in Baltimore at the time as a black person,
Was that a figurative speech, or did they literally weigh and measure
no,
them?
well, because remember, like they had these ID cards, and it's not like they could put their photo on the ID card.
Right.
They needed to have descriptions of them on. So they, oh, it says you're 180 pounds. Like, let's weigh you and see if you're like close enough to 180 pounds. It says you're 5'10". Let's measure you and make sure you're actually 5'10".
So this was all to like curtail enslaved black people escaping, right?
Right, exactly. But so if you were a black man in Baltimore at the time, you had to go through all of this to ride a train. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that people don't really believe the Alexander Scott story of helping them to the train station in Baltimore. That is the more commonly told version in the black community, or was for generations after the event. And I think it's probably because like it makes it more of a community effort, the escape. Mm-hmm. It involves like another local slave. Where the Gorsuch descendants believe the on foot version up York Road, which, like I said, is probably the more accurate one. I think it is also just worth mentioning a little bit that in stories like this, people often wonder like why more slaves didn't escape, mm-hmm. why it was a less common thing. And there's, obvious things like, just being psychologically battered and broken and having a, being institutionalized in a way, having strong ties to your family and friends who are still in slavery that you don't want to be separated from, and just escape was super dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like a big one is like the family thing. Like, it's hard to get away.
Yeah.
It's harder to get away if you've got like a kid.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And like, so most of the slaves that did run away didn't have small children with them. Like,
and that's exactly it. Is Ford, Burley, and the Hammonds were typical of escapees at the time. Most escapees
were young men.
Yeah, most escapees were young, about 80% between the ages of 16 and 35. Only one of the four men were married. None of them had kids. And, all four were still young. They were still in that age where you kind of value your personal well-being over bonds of kinship. Some other interesting things that kind of came up with how particularly young men in slavery viewed it is that after generations in the South, slaves at the time, a lot of them had similar views of honor versus shame, mm-hmm. as became as noted of like the Southern mentality.
Right.
And so being enslaved was caused a lot of mental stress. It was an ego blow, right, in a lot of ways. And young men were more likely to do something about that.
Right. Well, it's like you were saying, Gorsuch, like, he had a little bit of an inferiority complex just because he didn't really like come into his own as a businessman until later in life.
Yes.
Like, imagine if he was a slave.
Yeah, like, exactly.
Pride is pride.
Mm-hmm. So in the year July 1849 to July 1850, 279 slaves escaped in Maryland, which was the most of any state. So, a decent number, but really 279, like that shows you that it still wasn't a super common thing. Like 279 people escaping is a lot, but it's a small percentage of the people who were enslaved. Most slaves escaped in groups, just like Burley and the Hammonds. And most did it in response to an incident in which they feared retribution. So this was all kind of, these guys were Ford, Burley, and the Hammonds. It was super common, really a very common slave escape story.
Well, and it makes sense because, we're talking about how it's not that common of a thing to do because, a lot of people have shitty lives.
Right.
But there's a stability, to your shitty life. Like, there's things you can count on. Mm-hmm. Even if your life is pretty shitty.
Yeah.
There's a natural inclination not to want to risk getting worse.
Right.
But if, there's some sort of like horrible retribution, like about to be like handed down, then like the calculus changes. Mm-hmm. And then it's, it's time to go.
Absolutely. So the, another thing of note here is that free people just north of the Mason-Dixon line in Pennsylvania provided an image of freedom to those still enslaved, and that there is plenty of evidence that the two sides communicated often, and that, as much as there was talk of white abolitionists, black abolitionists, and the Underground Railroad were, key parts of helping these people to freedom. And that kind of goes back to what I touched on at the beginning, where the Fieldstone barn struck me as a cultural connection between the two regions. There was also cultural connection amongst black people between the two regions. And so Ford, Burley, and the Hammonds were all young, confident men who had an idea of what freedom was like. They had seen freedom just over the border, 20 miles to the north of them. So the next morning, Gorsuch awoke, found that his four men had escaped, and he was shocked and his pride was wounded. He blamed Abe Johnson for enticing the slaves. Like I had mentioned, there was a large fear. The whole rule about free black men not being allowed to carry abolitionist material.
Did he know about the escape, Abe Johnson?
Presumably, yeah.
I just wonder. I don't know. Do you know anything about the circumstances of his life?
I don't know anything about him beyond this.
Okay, I was just wondering, if he had a family or whatever. I don't know. It just seems like he might have wanted to go with.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this is kind of the end of Abe Johnson's story in the record. But yeah, Gorsuch saw his slaves as victims of Johnson, and believed that they would return soon because they couldn't survive on their own. This was the view of free black people at the time. This is why free black people couldn't carry abolitionist material by law, is they thought that they were going to entice the slaves away into a life that they couldn't survive on their own. So Gorsuch said that he would forgive them and accept them back once they realized that how hard it was out there in the world without him. And a year passed, and Gorsuch still believed that they would return. A year later, he was like, "Oh, they're definitely coming back." But at this point, he's like, "Well, now now they're staying away because they're afraid. They're afraid that they're going to get in trouble. If I could just get a hold of them, I could explain to them that all will be forgiven and they'll happily come back." He still, a year later, had not been able to locate Abe Johnson. He was still searching for him, still wanted him to be severely punished under the law, still viewed Abe Johnson as the villain in this story. So, he wasn't giving up the fight. He got some legal documents from the governor of Maryland saying that, he had these legal documents from the governor of Maryland saying that he could go into Pennsylvania and bring his property back. And so he took those papers. He had his son bring those papers up to Harrisburg, thinking that, the state of Pennsylvania would honor these papers and help him hunt down these men and bring them back. And Pennsylvania either didn't care or didn't know how to help the Gorsuches, so they kind of just ignored it. They're like, "Okay, great. You got some papers from the governor of Maryland saying that you can hunt for your slaves in our state."
Well, they're not here.
They're like, "What are we going to do about this?" Yeah. You're saying a year ago they went to Pennsylvania.
It's a big state, dude.
Yeah.
They're not in my office.
Right. So I don't know. Gorsuch was offended and angry that Harrisburg wouldn't help him in this quest. At this point, it's already crossing the threshold where it doesn't make financial sense. But his pride was wounded. He's already spent money traveling to Harrisburg. He's already, sent correspondence to people that he knows in Pennsylvania, paying postage. It's, like I mentioned, there wasn't a huge financial incentive to keep slaves in Northern Maryland anymore. And he's expending resources, for a year trying to track them down. And so at this point, he is already kind of losing money on this whole thing. And by the end of this story, he will absolutely be operating in the red. This is not a financially motivated quest. It has all to do with pride. It has all to do with these Southern notions of honor, and those Southern notions of honor are something that is going to play a role in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. The Southerners kind of have this thing where they despise the idea that they would be despised for being weak if their neighbors didn't see them as these big tough masters of the house, And that was absolutely what was motivating
They also
Gorsuch.
fought that war entirely incorrectly, I think, because of like notions of honor.
Yes.
Well, I mean, what do you do? What do you do when there's like, an invading force, like, on your home turf? Like, you fight it like you fight guerrilla style, like
Yes.
insurrection. Like,
Absolutely.
that's how you do it. That's what works. But like the Southern High Command, they were like, every single one of them was like, especially Robert E. Lee. They were all about like, the grand sweeping like cavalry charge that like took the day, and like they just like they won some cool military victories,
Mm-hmm.
but lost the war that like they probably could have won if they had just drawn it out.
Absolutely.
Like,
a war of attrition, they would have probably won.
Yeah, northern support was not high for the war. Like,
No.
I don't know. Anyway, so that's a different topic.
No, it all touches.
It's related.
It's all related because Gorsuch is motivated by these ideas of honor and pride and dignity and how he's going to be viewed by his neighbors. That's the only thing that is motivating him. This is not a financial thing. This is not because he needs them to operate his farm. This is purely because of a Southern man's ideas of like how he wants to be seen in the world.
And like religion, as we discussed earlier, notions of pride and like personal honor and things like that, sometimes that's like what someone needs to like, do something great. Like, kick that dude's ass that was trying to tie you up and beat you.
Yeah.
Like, Frederick Douglass was filled with like, a sense of like himself as a person. He wasn't going to be subservient anymore. Like, it can motivate you to do great things, but it can also motivate you to do stupid things.
Yes.
That don't benefit anyone.
Right. Which is what Gorsuch is doing here, and it's not going to go great for him or his friends. So 2 years in, at this point, Gorsuch receives a rumor that all 4 men are in Southeast Pennsylvania, living in different parts of Berks, Chester, or Montgomery counties. It's possible that they're moving around to avoid detection, or that a network of abolitionists are helping them,
or that he just doesn't know where they are.
Right. Well, the point of this rumor is that they haven't fled to Canada. Okay. They haven't fled to New York. They haven't fled to Massachusetts. Other abolition hotspots.
They're in the Tri-County area.
They're still just over the border. They're still close by, and Gorsuch receives a letter from a man in southeastern Pennsylvania, who signs it William MP, William Paget. He will, at this time, I think he is more or less unknown to Gorsuch. We'll talk about him a little bit more later in the series. But Paget is basically a professional snitch.
Okay.
He did other things. He was a clock repairman. And as he traveled around in his clock repairs, he would like look for signs of escaped slaves and then report back to slave catchers and slave marshals.
Was he just an asshole, or was he like a bad clock repairer and he needed the income?
I think that he liked it. I don't think it had any reflection on his abilities as a clock repairer. Okay. I think he just liked it. He liked skulking around, spying on people. And so it was, simple, like people would post something in the local, Paget operated out of Gap, Pennsylvania. So people would post something at the Gap Tavern that would say, escaped slave, here's my description of them, $50 for information leading to their capture.
I hear the Weis Market up there sells turkey thighs.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to check it out this week. But, yes. I'm sorry. Gap just reminded me.
Yeah, no, Gap's going to come up some more. But
it's just fun. It's fun that the story is all local.
It is, yes. So that's kind of what Paget did. He was like a semi-professional snitch. He would look for information on escaped slaves, supply the information to whoever was looking for them, and collect those kinds of $20 for information leading to this capture type of rewards. And so Paget, like I said, I don't have any reason to think that Paget knew Gorsuch at the time. So the letter that he sends Gorsuch is kind of insane. Okay. Where he writes, I have the required information of 4 men that is within 2 miles of each other. Now, the best way is for you to come as a hunter, disguised, about 2 days ahead of your son. Let him come by way of Philadelphia and get the deputy marshal, John Nagel, I think his name is. Tell him the situation, and he can get a force of the right kind. It will take about 12 or so that they can divide and take them all within a half an hour. Now, if you come on the 2nd or 3rd of September, I will meet you at the Gap. When you get there, inquire for Benjamin Clay's Tavern. Let your son and the marshal get out to Kinyer's Hotel. Now, if you cannot come at the time spoken of, write very soon and let me know when you can. I wish you come as soon as you possibly can. William M.P. They don't do hardly any of that.
Does he dress as a hunter?
No.
Because that's very important. That's an important part of the plan.
Yes, he does not come. He is not going to come disguised as a hunter. He is not going to send his son to get the deputy marshal. The deputy marshal they do get is not named John Nagel. They do not have a force of 12.
So this guy's got a very specific and elaborate plan all ready to go.
Yes, and they don't follow. And because I don't think they know it. I think he's just this like creepy snitch dude that like sends him the information he wants.
Do they meet with him?
They do. They
do meet with him.
They will eventually meet with Paget, and presumably Paget did get paid for his snitching. But this whole elaborate plan, like I don't know why he laid out that whole elaborate plan. It seems completely unnecessary.
It's like, here's what you're gonna do. See?
Yeah. It's like, no, that's not your job. You're not the tactician here. You're just the little creepy snitch who sneaks around spying.
Oh, maybe
on people.
that's the part that he likes. Maybe that's what he's in it for. He wants people, like he's just trying to get somebody to follow one of his weird plan.
Yes.
Like if D&D had existed then, and he was just allowed to be like a dungeon master, he wouldn't have been snitching on.
Yeah,
people.
maybe. So after 2 years, Gorsuch likely no longer believed that he could convince the 4 men to return, and had his party pack guns. And that's where we're going to stop.
All right.
And
ominous.
Yes. And next time, I am going to discuss some more background for the legalities of this whole situation and what led to the fugitive slave situation in the 1850s. And so it's going to be a little bit of time before we get to figure out exactly what happened with Gorsuch and his quest.
I mean, obviously, his quest is doomed to failure because he failed to dress as a hunter.
Yes. Probably what he should have done. Probably should have dressed as a hunter and snuck up and met Paget at the tavern.
But that's the part. Like, it wasn't like dress as a hunter and come around the back of the house and we'll surprise them. Like, he was like, you should dress as a hunter and then come meet me at this bar.
Yep.
I don't know. Paget's weird.
Yes. So that is the escape of the 4 men from Gorsuch Farm or Retreat Farm. And Gorsuch will now lead a force north to attempt to recapture them. And he's going to be met with a lot more resistance than he was anticipating. So thank you for listening, everybody. And next week I'll have some more background information.
And maybe a name.
Maybe a name. Right. Next week is context time.
Bye.
Bye.